Welcome back from a very brief break. Many of you are getting back behind the laptops, and as I don't wish to lose much more of your time in this session, let me very briefly introduce Sophus to Ermgassen from the University of Kent, that will talk about infrastructure for all within planetary boundaries, followed by Sietse Noorder from Leiden University about the anticipated post-growth effects on insular biodiversity, an island perspective. And as the last speaker in this contributed session, we have Vanessa Lambrecht from the Greater Middle East platform about the challenge for Western actors to be inclusive in degrowth actions and working for environmental justice and ensuring participation from the Middle East and the North African region. Sophus, once you're ready, the floor is yours.
Oh, thanks so much for inviting me to talk today. It's a real pleasure and privilege. I've been looking forward to finding a community of people working on the intersection between post-growth economics and conservation science for a long time. And then this workshop came about just at the right time when I was losing hope that this community of practice existed. So this is just a real pleasure. So today I'm going to talk about infrastructure for all within planetary boundaries. The idea here is that I spent the last 3 years or so as a conservation scientist, but I'm an ecological economist by training, and I'm just growing interested that the world is in the grips of a global infrastructure boom, and the dominant approach within conservation science appears to be sort of making up for the harms caused by infrastructure through things like biodiversity offsetting. But I think that completely neglects the structural drivers of infrastructure expansion and infrastructure overproduction, which comes much more from the discipline of ecological economics. And I think there's a real space to combine biodiversity conservation and ecological economics in the context of infrastructure. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So very quickly, I mean, I've only got 15 minutes, but I'll talk to you about a lot of the work that I've been doing for the last 3 years, which is the evidence that we can actually make up for the harms caused by infrastructure expansion. And then I'm going to move on to the ecological economics of what I call infrastructure overproduction, which borrows a lot from Herman Daly's theory of uneconomic growth, but applied to infrastructure systems. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about why I think that correcting for the harms caused by infrastructure expansion is just nowhere near enough. It's not the paradigm shift required to achieve fundamental biodiversity conservation, and we need to instead address the structural drivers of nature loss and infrastructure overproduction. And I'll focus on the work that we're doing now on the case study of housing infrastructure in the United Kingdom. So really quickly, I mean, most of my work focuses around these issues. So we've got the Sustainable Development Goals, and I'm particularly interested in trade-offs between goals 7 and goals 14 and 15. So just as a really quick recap, the world is in the grips of the most rapid expansion of infrastructure in human history. It's projected that we'll have 1.2 million square kilometers of additional urban area between 2000 and 2030. I think that stats has been updated since. It's projected we'll have 4 million kilometers of new roads by 2050. And according to the Global Infrastructure Hub, we'll spend over $60 trillion on new infrastructure over the next 2 decades, which is just an unfathomable increase in the world's built infrastructure. Now, a lot of the work that I've been doing, as I say, has been on biodiversity compensation policies. So these are policies that come from the discipline of conservation science that try to make up for the harms caused by land use change and infrastructure expansion. And in short, I mean, I'm just going to really quickly summarize some of the work I've done here, but these kind of policies, these national policies that make up for the harms caused by infrastructure cover an awful lot of the world. And actually, if you map where infrastructure is projected to happen over the next few decades and where these policies exist, there's an awful lot of biodiversity conservation that will fall within the realm of these biodiversity compensation policies. So, I mean, the panel C there basically shows that about 3/4 of all the projected infrastructure spending in the next 2 decades will fall within countries that have some kind of mandatory biodiversity compensation policy. And that covers about half of all the world's birds. Do biodiversity offsets work, which is some of the work that I did a couple of years ago. This is a review of the outcomes of biodiversity offsets around the world, publishing conservation letters. And in short, yeah, sometimes biodiversity offsets work, sometimes they don't. The key patterns are, according to the most recent database on biodiversity, on the actual implementation of biodiversity offsets around the world, about 2/3 of them happen in forests. And we found no evidence that an offset's ever officially achieved no net loss of biodiversity in forests. And also these so-called avoided loss systems, which create protected areas to compensate for losses. These have never achieved no net loss of biodiversity, according to the scientific literature. And that's the kind of biodiversity offsetting that's used in Australia, for example. And we'll move on from that. And so one of the things I've been doing recently is looking at England's new biodiversity compensation policy to ask, is it going to work? So it's a really nice example of the intersection between post-growth and conservation here, because the UK's got these interlinking policy challenges. It's got, it claims it has a housing crisis, and this is a map of projected housing expansion over the next few decades. And simultaneously, it's made world-leading sort of political commitments to address biodiversity loss. So, for example, the UK government has now claimed that it's going to bring in a legally binding target to halt basically wildlife declines by 2030. But you can't, I mean, I'm interested in exploring the space between these commitments to expand infrastructure networks and these commitments to protect biodiversity. Now, we did the first paper that looked at the outcomes of England's new biodiversity compensation system. And in short, what have we found? Well, it doesn't actually stop infrastructure expansion at all. Under the policy, we found a 34% reduction in non-urban habitats. And we reviewed the literature and spoke, I'm quite heavily embedded throughout this entire policy network in England. And we find big governance gaps that mean that lots of these biodiversity promises might not be delivered. And the way that they assess ecological condition under the policy can potentially be gamed and all sorts of things. But it's still, this new policy is still probably better for biodiversity than the existing planning system. But anyway, I mean, that's most of the work I've been doing for the last 3 years. And it just got me thinking, you know, instead of just making up for the harms of infrastructure, conservation is just missing the point if it thinks that sticking plasters on a system of perpetual expansion is going to fundamentally address biodiversity loss. So then it got me thinking about the intersection between post-growth economics here and conservation science. In order to achieve no harm to nature whilst building infrastructure networks in some places, there's no doubt in my mind that we need both conservation science to make sure that infrastructure is as little as minimizes the damage it does to nature, but we also need to address the fundamental political economy of infrastructure over expansion. So in conservation science, we have all of these impact mitigation solutions, but the embedded environmental impacts of infrastructure are just so large. So not just looking at land use change, but even if we look at like the materials embedded in the supply chains of infrastructure, it's just unbelievably large. So here's some work led by Aurora Torres that I'm part of, which looks at the supply chain impacts of sand and construction minerals across the world. And again, it's unfathomably large. We've got some work coming out shortly that shows that there are over 1,000 species around the world directly, like on the red list, threatened by sand and sand mining. But here's the real question. Do we actually need all this infrastructure? And this is where I think post-growth economics comes in. So this is one of my favorite plots from Habel et al. In 2019 that shows essentially the social progress index, which is a composite indicator of social progress on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, it's material stocks of concrete per capita per country. And what you can see is the classic satiation curve that you get with GDP well-being metrics. Yes, improving infrastructure networks, putting concrete in the ground does improve well-being up to a point, up to around 50 tons per capita. But after that, there's this satiation point. And in the most extreme form, you've got New Zealand, which achieves a much higher social progress index than the Czech Republic, but with 5 times less concrete per capita. So what's going on here? Like, why do we keep on producing new infrastructure if it's not fundamentally meeting social needs? And this is where I think the concept of infrastructure overproduction comes in. So what I'm doing is borrowing a lot here from Herman Daly's theory of uneconomic growth, and also some of the work of Tim Jackson in the University of Surrey on growth dependencies. So do rich countries really need more roads or more airports or more houses? Are they going to really address our fundamental social needs? Here's the question. And I think the best example that I've seen in the academic literature of this particular conundrum is from Villela et al. In 2020, who looked at road building in the Amazon and found that only around half of all of the roads projected to be built in the Amazon generate net negative economic benefits. And this doesn't even account for the negative externalities of lost carbon. So this is purely essentially like construction costs and other costs part of the construction process, found that these would actually generate fewer economic benefits than their actual costs. And then once you actually start accounting for the negative externalities, this just goes off the charts. So much infrastructure we produce generates negative returns to society. So what's going on here? Well, I think the UK is a really nice example of this. The UK, one of the richest countries in the world, about 6th richest according to the World Bank, and it consumes much more than its fair share of ecological space. So this is from the classic Raworth donut economics model that Dan O'Neill published in 2019. This is the UK's donut, essentially. You can see that UK overshoots on a bunch of different environmental indicators and undershoots on a couple of social welfare indicators. In the UK, it's claimed that there's a housing crisis. And so the UK government policy is aiming to build 300,000 new homes per year for the rest of the decade, but we'll never achieve net gain or we'll never achieve no impact to nature if we can't address the potential expansion of infrastructure. Do we really need all this new homes? So this is the work that I'm leading now with a really awesome interdisciplinary group of scientists. Essentially, in England, we have 1.3 million excess homes, but prices continue to rise, even though we're continuing to build new ones. So we've got this team that spans structural engineering, post-growth economics, economists who specialize in housing and credit, and then in biodiversity science to work out if it's possible to provide housing for all without destroying nature. And so this is a project that unites conservation science with post-growth economics. So one of the things we're doing is estimating the ecological impacts of new housing. And this is a wonderful paper by Sereno et al. That basically, in short, it's a structural engineering paper, and it found that if you want to meet the UK's carbon targets whilst expanding the housing network, it simply basically can't realistically be done without a reduction in the demand for floor area per capita. And therefore, we need to think about better ways of using the existing housing stock in order to achieve no impacts on nature. So other things that this project is doing is that we're working with this team to build a bottom-up model of all of the embodied carbon emissions in new housing projections and estimate the biodiversity and carbon losses from land use change from this projected housing expansion. But then we need to ask why, if we have 1.3 million excess homes in England or in the United Kingdom, why are we still building homes? Why? What are the structural drivers that are driving perpetual growth in housing, unsustainable growth in housing? And the answer is really interesting and complicated here. We bring in insights from political economy and post-growth political economy. But the answers, in short, are financialization of the housing market, changes to credit restrictions over the last few years, government policy, and a little bit of corruption. So in short, I only have 3 minutes left, so I have to be very brief. Essentially, in very, very trying macroeconomic conditions, there's infinite demand from the global financial sector for stable investments. And the UK housing sector is seen as a very stable investment. And so you essentially have infinite global demand from the financial sector for safe investments in the UK housing stock. So that's why you have essentially almost limitless financial inflows and a limited stock, which drives up prices. And this, of course, pushes essentially poor people out of the housing market. So you've also got a government policy that does things like pushes for the perpetual expansion of housing, and in the UK, a very strong culture of home ownership that you don't necessarily have in Europe. And then you have the corruption element is this murky influence of the housing lobby in UK politics. According to Transparency International, around 1/5 of all of the political donations to the ruling Conservative Party come from the housing industry. So what can be done about the perpetual expansion of housing? And this is what our project is working on. We don't have the answers yet. And so this is something I really hope that we can talk about over the next few months. But in short, on the conservation side, we need conservation policies to make up for the harm of new infrastructure where infrastructure is necessary. And I actually don't think all of it is necessary. But then what we're doing is applying the provisioning systems approach of Julia Steinberger in some of her recent incredible papers to ask, how can we meet everybody's housing needs, but whilst minimizing the environmental costs of meeting those needs. And I think there's a number of policies that we're going to discuss in our work. So we're going to explore potential land value taxes, which mean that it's less valuable to hold housing as a speculative financial asset, which should hopefully bring down house prices and mean that poorer people can afford homes. Taxation on second homes. There are currently about 700,000 second homes in the UK, and taxation on second homes should hopefully free up some existing stock, again, so that homeless people and people in insecure housing can enter the housing market. Taxation on foreign home ownership, also probably very important for creating a more sustainable use of the overall housing stock, a more ecologically efficient use of the housing stock. And then, of course, there's been a huge change in housing policy over the last few decades, where the government no longer builds much social housing. But we'd argue that has to change. And in the post-war period, the government built a huge amount of social housing for people who couldn't afford to buy housing from the private sector. And that's changed. And I think we'd argue that has to change back if you want to meet everybody's needs, but without building too much new housing. And then you need to address the growth dependency. So we're working with a PhD student in Professor Tim Jackson's group, who specializes in these growth dependencies. And I think there's an element of public accountability here, and potentially a system for changing mortgage credit, tightening up mortgage credit so that it's not too easy to get mortgages, so you don't have essentially infinite cash flowing into the housing sector. So in short, biodiversity offsets can theoretically work, but I'm growing very dissatisfied with the idea.
Let me interrupt you with the summary in case you want to take a question or perhaps two.
Yeah, super. Okay, so that's great. So thanks very much. So yeah, are there any questions?
And my apologies for being so intrusive.
No, it's great.
Yeah,
it's very good to keep it to time.
Okay, thank you.
There's my email in case anybody wants to email us about this work.
Okay, I see a question by Iago.
Yeah, thanks a lot for an amazing presentation that actually allowed me to discover a new field of research I was not really aware of. My question to you, I think this research has a big potential for changing things. My question to you would be, what stakeholders do you have on board, and what communication plan have you designed? Like, for example, when speaking about taxing second houses and so on, do you foresee a plan of communication working alongside stakeholders to make that possible, that this goes beyond the academic domain?
Yeah, great question. So in short, I'll be starting a 3.5-year postdoc in 6 months' time, and one of the main focus of that postdoc is it's going to be focusing on changing the narratives about the role that the public sector can play in biodiversity conservation. And I don't have a good answer to your question yet. I mean, I'm very interested in this. This first project is all about me trying to understand the system and the levers that we need to pull, but this is with no focus yet on political feasibility. I'm more interested in like the biophysical limits. And once I actually understand the system, I think I'll have a much better idea of well, my focus will change onto how to actually changing it, but it's not there yet because I don't understand enough yet, I think.
Thank you. I think it's a very good start. Congratulations.
Thanks very much, Iago.